Hello again everyone, welcome back to the channel for quite possibly my most important video. In 43 AD, after nearly a century of on-again off-again relations with the island of Britain, the time had come for the Roman conquest of the island. A tale of political ambition, military glory and fierce tribal resistance. And we start with the Claudian invasion. So why did the Romans want to invade Britain? Well, firstly, there's Emperor Claudius, newly installed as emperor after the assassination of Caligula. Now, a lot of senators saw him as weak, and he'd never commanded an army before, and in order to shore up his position in Rome, a military conquest would be a perfect thing to do. And what better one to do than one that even Julius Caesar had failed to complete? It would shore up his position and silence a lot of his critics. However, there were economic factors as well, as Britain was seen to be wealthy in natural resources, with things like tin, copper, lead, silver and even gold. It exported things like cattle, grain, hides, slaves and even hunting dogs, and had oysters and pearls, although it has to be said that the historian Tacitus is quite rude about British pearls, saying that they do not rank high in merit. Strategically, the time was also ripe for the invasion. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were quieter than normal, so there were troops to spare for the invasion, and Julius Caesar had already shown that an invasion, however difficult, was possible. The final pretext for invasion came in the form of Bericus, otherwise known as Verica, the pro-Roman king of the Atrebates in Britain. He came to the court of Emperor Claudius seeking help, having been ousted from power by the rising Cativalorni under Caratacus and Togodumnus, the children of Cunobelin. Now this was a request that Claudius was all too happy to oblige in. The army that invaded Britain was led by a man called Aulus Plautius, a very well-respected Roman general. He possibly brought with him the 9th Legion Hispania, who had served with him when he was governor of Pannonia. We know for a fact that the 2nd Legion Augusta were present in Britain under a future Roman emperor, Vespasian. Now, although the 2nd Legion Augusta is the only legion attested to in the ancient sources, historians assume that 4 legions were involved in the invasion of Britain, being the 2nd Legion Augusta, the 9th Legion Hispania, the 14th Legion Gemina and the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix. Together with auxiliary troops, the number of troops would have totalled some 40,000 men. These legions may have included troops assembled by Caligula for his own invasion that he planned a few years earlier, but as I covered in my previous video on the gap between Caesar and Claudius, this invasion didn't happen. But it is entirely plausible that Claudius took advantage of the preparations made by his predecessor. Interestingly, Claudius's army was very reluctant to embark. Nearly 100 years before, when Caesar had invaded Britain, his soldiers knew, more or less, that they would be coming back, whereas Claudius's army was being sent on a more permanent basis, a very daunting prospect for a legionary, looking across the channel at the great unknown. According to Cassius Dio, the imperial freedman Narcissus had to persuade the troops to go. And after he had successfully done so, the troops assembled along the coast, ready to invade Britain. It should be worth noting at this point that Claudius was still in Rome, waiting for a signal from Plautius to join them across the channel. The main launching point for the invasion was probably modern-day Boulogne, and the main landing point was probably Richborough in Kent, but there's a lot of debate about the subject, with other places being suggested as the main landing point, including Dover, Chichester and Southampton. but the archaeological evidence points more towards it being Richborough than any of the others, but I stress the debate is still very much open on the subject. Cassius Dio tells us that the Romans landed in 3 waves, but he's frustratingly unclear about what he means by this. Does he mean there were 3 separate embarkations, that there were 3 separate landing grounds, or does he mean that there were 3 waves that all landed at the same place? It's very unclear. What we do know is that there were no Brittonic forces in place to meet the Romans when they landed. Whether through miscalculation or strategic retreat, we don't know, but the Romans were able to get across uncontested, and were able to have a firm foothold in Britain before they headed further inland. With no opposition on the coast, Plautius headed further inland, even getting the surrender of the Dobuni tribe, possibly because they were discontent with the rising power of the Cativalorni. But soon enough Plautius came across the main Brittonic force under Caratacus and Togodumnus. They fought 2 initial skirmishes, of which the Romans won, but the main battle came at the river Medway. On the first day of battle, the Britons were camped on the opposite side of the river, possibly thinking that the Romans wouldn't be able to cross, but Plautius had a surprise in store. He had auxiliary troops, possibly Batavians, swim across in full armour to give the Britons a horrible surprise. They got to the opposite side and used their missiles to kill the horses that pulled the Britons' chariots. Plautius then sent Vespasian and his brother Sabinus with more troops to back up the initial attack, and fighting kept going until nightfall. On the second day of battle, Gnaeus Hosidius Geta, another general in the army, possibly with the aid of the 9th Legion, led a daring attack against the Britons. He was almost captured by the enemy, but the Roman legions managed to turn the tide of battle and drove the Britons off. For his efforts, Geta was actually awarded a triumph back home in Rome. The Britons fell back to the River Thames, but here, just as at the Medway, the Romans made their way across. What's really interesting though is the Britons decided not to destroy a bridge that was located further downstream, which gave the Romans an opportunity to cross over in force. But once the Romans had crossed, they lost a lot of men in the marshes of Essex. It was at this point, or somewhere around here anyway, that Togodumnus is supposed to have died, a big blow to the Brittonic cause. With resistance weakened, Plautius halted the army near Camulodunum, and he sent word to Rome. It was time for Claudius to arrive and seal the victory. After a campaign that had already seen significant victories, Claudius finally arrived 6 weeks later. But he didn't arrive alone. He brought with him elephants, a dramatic show of strength, as the Britons had never seen elephants before. Once he was in Britain, Claudius wasted no time. He led the attack himself on Camulodunum, and it was a resounding success, the arrival of the Emperor seemingly upping the morale of his troops. Once he had taken Camulodunum, he took the submission of 11 British tribes there, marking the start of Roman dominance in Britain. To seal the victory, Camulodunum was made the provincial capital of Britannia. And if you want to learn more about Camulodunum, don't you worry, I've made a video for that. You can find that somewhere up here. Now, Camulodunum would continue to be an important city for the Romans, a great symbol of Roman power and presence on the island. Now, it's probably worth mentioning at this point that by the time Claudius arrived in Britain, the campaign was pretty much over. Plautius had already won great victories at the Medway and the Thames, and he probably could have done the job himself. So it's likely that he had an arrangement with Claudius to let him know when the campaign was a foregone conclusion so that he could come over from Rome and claim glory. Despite his dramatic entrance, Claudius didn't stay in Britain very long. He was here for 16 days before he headed back to Rome, having achieved his aim of being the hero who took Britannia. In the aftermath, resistance hadn't ended. Caratacus had survived the attack on Camulodunum and had fled to Wales, where he continued to be a thorn in the Empire's side. But what about Verica, the king of the Atrebates, whose arrival in Rome had sparked the invasion in the first place? Well, we don't know. He disappears from the historical record, which to me suggests that he really didn't matter to the Romans very much, beyond being an open excuse for an invasion. He slowly disappears from the historical record as the Romans take control. However, at the same time, someone else was rising to prominence in the area that Verica once ruled. His name was Cogidubnus, and he was a loyal client king for Rome. The magnificent villa of Fishbourne was probably built for him, showing how the Romanisation of the Britons had already started very shortly after the Claudian invasion. So the Claudian invasion was a success. The Romans had managed to win magnificent victories at the Medway and Thames, taken Camulodunum, and they had also taken the submission of 11 native tribes, taking control of southeastern Britain, all within a matter of months. And Claudius could claim the glory that he sought back home in Rome. But the conquest of Britain was far from over. Much of Britain still lay outside of Roman control, with the likes of Caratacus fleeing to Wales and rallying the tribes there in defiance against the Romans. At the same time, Roman expansion would continue, with the likes of Vespasian leading the 2nd Legion Augusta into the southwest of Britain. I'm planning on covering these other aspects of the conquest of Britain in their own separate videos, including other things such as Cartimandua and the Brigantes, and also Agricola's invasion of Scotland, so please make sure you stay tuned for those. But I think that's it. I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit about the Claudian invasion. It's truly an astonishing subject, and it's only now that I've had time to actually delve into it properly, so I hope you've enjoyed. And please make sure you like, comment and subscribe, it helps immensely, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao for now.